mostly about eclipses. And so a lot of the information you'll get, now some of it, of course, is hard to apply, but it's chapter 5. And the thing is that even in this particular text, you know, he does say that should a solar eclipse occur at the end of the fortnight, again, I'm reading the translation book I have, it's not my own translation. Should a solar eclipse occur at the end of the fortnight after a lunar, people would become unruly and unjust in their behavior. And couples, you know, would have problems. And then should a lunar take place at the end of the next fortnight after a solar, it says the Brahmins would perform many sacrifices and be blessed with the fruit thereof, and all the subjects would be happy and contented. So really what he's saying is that if you have an eclipse and, you know, it starts with the solar and goes to the lunar, it, you know, kind of acts like you would normally expect a waxing cycle to be, you know, that it would be fruitful, you know, and the waxing cycle would then be, you know, very productive. Whereas if you go from a full moon to a new moon, because, you know, the new moon is dark. So if you go from the full moon to the new moon or the lunar to the solar, you know, it's not going to be, you know, as fruitful. Now, I have to say that in all honesty, that it sounds really great in theory, but it doesn't always, I don't know, it doesn't seem to always, you know, work out that way. And, you know, that's, you know, just, you know, what I'll say. I mean, it doesn't mean to say that just because something is in a text, you know, that, you know, we think that it has to always, you know, follow and be perfect that way. But I do find that, you know, as a general rule, you know, if you want to talk about that, the only reason, you know, one of the reasons I say that is also because if you go back to the December 2019, there was an eclipse December 26, 2019. That was a solar. And that was one of the ones that I did think that it really kind of portended for not such nice things in 2020. I think we talked about this last year. And then the January 10th eclipse 2020 was a lunar. So that did go in a waxing cycle, but that was really when, you know, it started to become known that there was this virus, you know. So I don't know in that case.
Right. It's interesting when you think about the increase and decrease, the waxing and waning, and even in that sense, and where you were looking at that eclipse in December 2019, and that then led to a full moon lunar eclipse, that kind of increase of that. What I found really interesting as well is just looking at, even though it's not an eclipse, but the next full moon, we've just had a total lunar eclipse. The next full moon on the 24th of June is at the same degree as that eclipse at 9 degrees of Sagittarius. So I kind of thought, okay, it's not an eclipse, but at the same time, are we at some sort of culmination point, or are we at some turning point in this pandemic, perhaps, you know, in June? It's interesting when you look at, because when you look at the eclipses, obviously, and I'm sure you are always considering the eclipses, but every lunar phase, every full moon and new moon each month. So that was something I thought was interesting. But one other thing I remember Camilla Sutton mentioned about, you know, this, I don't know if you found this to be true yourself, is that when there's a lunar followed by a solar, she says something like that it's more worldly concerns, as opposed to the solar, then the lunar, more like spiritual issues. I don't know, maybe it's just like you just said, it's like the waning, right? It's the waning of the moon. And so there's maybe more, what she would say, worldly concerns, maybe issues on the planet.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest problem with some of that is that it sounds really great in theory, but I just don't find it always works out that way. But I do find that it is interesting that the last bunch of eclipses, you know, are from lunar to solar. So we are dealing with that, you know, that tendency right now. And the thing is that when you look at the eclipses from last year, you know, because as I said, there were, you know, 3 eclipses last year in the summer. So we had, the first one after the December and January one, we had one at June 5th, and that was a lunar. So it went from lunar to solar on June 21st, and then it went from solar to lunar on July 5th. So we had a whole month of, we had the eclipses run the gamut of a lunar month. So that's always kind of an interesting one, because when you have 3 eclipses, obviously one of them is going to be lunar to solar and the other is going to be solar to lunar, unless it starts with a solar, then it goes from solar to lunar and then lunar to solar. But, it kind of runs that, runs that gamut. But these coming up, the one from last November, the one from last week, May, the one on November 19th, they are all lunar to solar. And then next year, of course, we're not really going to go into 2022, but 2022 does start a solar to lunar. So that's why I do think that's part of the reason I do think 2022, we're going to have recovery. This year it's kind of going teeter, it goes back and forth. Because, in America, we've been doing really well. And then you look at India and they kind of went completely downhill. You know what I mean? So it's not consistent, throughout the world. Of course, each eclipse, if you did each eclipse for every country, it's going to be different as well. If you have the time to sit and do that. But the point is that, also you have to look at the leader of the country, which I do, all the time, which is what's, especially in America, it's been fascinating with Trump and Biden. But, I think that the thing is that it is kind of fascinating that from last year, last November through the end of this year, they're all from lunar to solar. And then you get next year, as I said, you get the ones in April and May, solar to lunar. And then you get October, November 2022, again, solar to lunar. And then 2023, solar to lunar, and October 2023, solar to lunar. So it's kind of fascinating that the ones in 2022 and 2023 are all solar to lunar, whereas this year and the end of last year, they're all lunar to solar. So it kind of is interesting if you do look at it that way, that because it doesn't always happen that way, that it's consistent, for a few eclipses like it is now, and then next year, sort of that, upward climb. So it's kind of an interesting thing just to ponder, and look at and think about, sort of interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great for us to be able to watch this now for the next couple of years to see if we can draw conclusions from it as well with what's going on.
Right. And also these that are going from lunar to solar are all in Taurus and Scorpio, as I said. So that's the other interesting thing, that all of these Taurus Scorpio eclipses, except the one next year that kind of slips back into Taurus Scorpio before it stays in Aries Libra, are all the lunar to solar ones. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. What I flagged about because I'd love to talk about now Taurus and Scorpio more so, the dynamics involved there. What I flagged about that, like if you just look back at the last 2 cycles of the nodes there, like the Iraq war last time before that, it was, Band-Aid, Ethiopia, the famine. It's always about resources, it seems, obviously the main theme of Taurus Scorpio. Had you looked at any of those major themes when you were looking at this set of eclipses this year?
Well, I look at the Saros cycle, but I look a lot at that, what we call the metonic cycle. The metonic cycle are eclipses that repeat every 19 years. So, when they repeat, that means that, and sometimes in between, you also will get that same degree, but the opposite kind of eclipse. So, so of course, when you're looking at eclipses, when you're starting to really look at the history, of them, one of the things that you're going to look at, of course, are the cycles of the signs. And that's, but the 18 Saros cycle, the 19-year metonic cycle, the nodal cycle is 18.6 years. So it definitely goes, hand in hand with, that kind of cycle. So when you look at the